Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, September 5th, 2017. Ready for one more show on our temporary solution? Well, we hope so. Hopefully everything is working correctly and on the up and up. All the meters look good. That's nice. We still unsure about whether or not we'll have Skype with us. We're going to give it another try tomorrow and try and get Greg on the air and see if we can fix things up in time for Joan to get around, whether we use Skype or any other video, audio, conferencing type service. And the new computer is on the way, and bits and pieces of it are already shipping. That's the good news. The bad news is it's the mouse. The mouse is shipping, but the computer isn't shipping for a couple more days. But we dropped an extra $13 for some expedited shipping in an effort to get the thing here a little bit earlier and maybe salvage some shows. It looks like it will arrive midweek, hopefully next week. Which, of course, means, well, yesterday, of course, we had off for Labor Day. Off meaning we pre-recorded the show. Of course, it was brand new. For those of you who listen, thank you for tuning in. And we use that as an excuse to bypass Greg's first day with us during the week, which might not have worked out thanks to our continuing audio difficulties. We're narrowing in, I think, on the problem, but I'm pretty sure the new computer will solve it completely. We'll just rebuild things from the ground up, and once we get it right, we set that computer aside, and it doesn't do anything but handle the show. Nobody touches it. We put it in a sealed container in an undisclosed secure location. I don't know, maybe in Fort Knox even. Steve Mnuchin will be on the show later today. He can tell you what's going on. Thank you very much, by the way, to all of you who are continuing supporters of the show, as honestly you all ought to be, if you can manage it, at patreon.com, patreon.com, and you can find us there. Type in Kagro X, type in David Waldman, type in Kagro in the Morning, type in Daily Coast Radio in the search window. You'll find us, and you'll find an easy way to make recurring donations to keep us going month to month here, and your contributions have enabled us to secure this new computer. So thanks very much for that. And we hope to return the favor with continued, we'll borrow from Rush Limbaugh, broadcasting excellence, which is okay to say. We're not actually broadcasting here, so we're not stealing it per se. And if he wants to sue us for using two words, I guess that would be fine. That would make us famous, and everything will, everything works out for famous people, right? Okay. Well, let's see. Where are we this morning? We have, I've got already a tweet, a direct message, if you will, and I know that you will, from Greg, who won't be with us this morning, but he sent on a piece that is of some importance, brings us back to a topic that we addressed. Did we address it on, I can't recall whether I did it yesterday or we talked about it on Friday. But at any rate, let's see. We've got this piece from him about, it's not about DACA, but everything now will involve DACA, of course, because I noticed this morning Donald Trump tweets that it's time for Congress to get ready to do their job, which, of course, is not anything that he could help them get ready for or discuss what it means to get ready to do your job or anything like that. But it looks like he's thinking he'll be handing over responsibility for what to do to them. It looks for all the world like he's scrambling to get out of responsibility for doing that thing he promised essentially to. Well, I was going to say the thing he promised to do during the campaign, but he promised to do 2 or maybe even 3 or 4 completely contradictory things, not just on immigration, but on the narrow subject of the Dreamers. But we'll get to that in just a minute. First, we'll start with the procedural note that Greg sent to us. Let's see. We've got this piece here, and he's excerpted the bit that he likes the best, but I think the article's worth our time. We'll just comb through the whole thing. It's from Forbes magazine, Stan Collender, is the writer. Stan Collender is we can look at his full bio, but as I recall, he was a big budget process expert, worked on the Hill for many years. Here we are. He's been involved with the federal budget and congressional budget process throughout his entire career, in addition to being one of the few people who has served on the staffs of the House and Senate budget committees. He's also the author of the Guide to the Federal Budget, published annually from 1982 to 2000, and one of the most assigned texts on the topic. There's much more here, but that should probably suffice for this part. This is a refinement. This offers a refinement to my answers the other day, whether it was Friday or Monday, about why it wasn't necessarily such a big deal that the Senate parliamentarian had finally ruled that authority to use the reconciliation instructions for Affordable Care Act repeal would expire at the end of this fiscal year. The fiscal year, of course, ending on September 30th. Of course. I say that like everybody knows. You all know, though, of course. And there's of course again. Now it's becoming a new crutch. Never mind. Moving on. I did say, it might not be as big a deal as we think, because it may be that they can simply renew the authority with a new budget resolution, and it's absolutely true that they can do that. But Stan Collender has his doubts about whether or not the Congress has actually got its act together to pass a budget resolution, and that's a good question. So let's dive right into his article. We'll comment on that rather than trying to stumble our way through it ourselves. This is datelined yesterday, September 4th. Last week was Trump's worst legislative week ever, and Congress wasn't even in session. It's a pretty bold headline, right? Donald Trump last week suffered enormous setbacks on his three highest legislative priorities, and Congress wasn't even in session. Each of these losses took away most or all of the leverage Trump is going to need to get Congress to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, fund his wall, and do something on taxes. As a result, Trump's legislative agenda, which was already in deep trouble before last week, is now in a complete shambles. The most complete shambles. A part of a complete shambles breakfast, as a matter of fact. Toast, juice, milk, and Trump shambles. It's recommended. Trump's biggest problem occurred when the parliamentarian ruled on Friday that the Senate had only until September 30th to use the reconciliation instructions from fiscal year 2017's budget resolution to consider Affordable Care Act repeal and replace legislation. While this appears to be the kind of ruling only a budget process geek like me could love, are we geeks like him, or are we a different kind? It actually has enormous political implications for Trump. As of October 1st, the Senate will need 60 votes rather than a simple majority to pass the health care change the White House has been promising and demanding. Not that they won't attempt it, by the way, but of course, the chances of them getting to 60 is, I would imagine, near zero. But as he puts it, there aren't 60 votes in the Senate to do anything on health care. The White House does have options to move forward after September 30th, but they will all make repeal and replace even more difficult than the exasperating, for Trump anyway, problem it has already been. Trump could, for example, decide to work with Democrats on a bipartisan plan, but along with the congressional Republican leadership, he so far hasn't shown any interest in doing that, and I don't know that there's any interest in doing that even on the Democratic side at this point. Congress could also try to pass a fiscal 2018 budget resolution with new reconciliation instructions to do health care, which is what we discussed, but the House and Senate don't seem ready or possibly able to adopt a budget. That's a possibility. They could get their act together. The budget is the kind of political document that the party leaders can usually whip people into shape for and get passed. But, that's of course only the first step that would authorize the use of reconciliation. But Collender has more points about that. So we'll continue and maybe discuss. Although this might be the opportune moment to pause and say the House Budget Committee has written a budget for fiscal year 2018, and it does include reconciliation instructions, and they are vague enough, and they do include the same committees that were instructed in the 2017 budget resolution to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And the instructions rarely get more detailed than naming a committee and naming some arbitrary amount of money that they are supposed to save. And I think they just pegged it at $1 billion from the Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, I think, were both the ones tasked in the 2017 budget for Affordable Care Act repeal. The 2018, fiscal year 2018 budget likewise instructs Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce, but also a long list of additional committees. And apparently that's in anticipation of using reconciliation for tax reform or something like it. And it touches on a number of different areas of jurisdiction. It's not just going to be the Ways and Means Committee that does it. But I did notice that they put some really big numbers on the reconciliation instructions. Not that it matters, because none of the instructions matter anymore, apparently. Even this parliamentarian was happy to let them go. They routinely, by the way, they include instructions, a deadline for when the instructed committees are supposed to report to the budget committee what their changes are going to be, and it is routinely ignored, and I never really understood that. I don't know why they keep putting it in there. I kind of understand why they ignore it. I don't know what the precedent is for ignoring it other than, well, we feel like ignoring it, and by majority vote you can waive the things anyway, so what the hell, let's go for it, and that's enough. But why even bother putting the deadlines in? They're very unrealistic deadlines very often. But this time around in the 2018 budget, they, rather than putting in the $1 billion target for savings, some of these committees are targeted with saving like $30 and $50 billion. So I don't know. And so far, I have never seen parliamentarians waive the floors on savings, so that if you come back with a reconciliation bill that doesn't save as much as it's supposed to in the instructions, it has, I think, to this point, almost always put the eligibility in jeopardy. So I don't really know why they bother to peg those numbers so high. I mean, I know they want to brag on big numbers, but just peg them at $1 billion and then talk about how much your budget is going to save, or what your actual appropriations savings end up being, and brag on that. I don't know why you would want to risk losing eligibility. But the House, they're stupid. They don't care. They don't understand the Senate as it is. Anyway, continuing with Stan Collander's piece, that's not where it ends. Let's say, that they do pass new reconciliation instructions, and that they, as a result of adopting a budget, they have some new instructions. They get their act together and do it. Then what happens? Well, they can, of course, not only do new reconciliation, but they could combine the two bills. As I mentioned, whenever it was we discussed it, that they could do an omnibus reconciliation bill that has both health care repeal and taxes in it. But I think Collender correctly points out here, that would be perhaps even more difficult to pass. I think it's true to say it would absolutely be more difficult to pass, but it's crazy time out there. So I'm just going to say perhaps. That's my big hedge. So Collender writes it this way. Another option, combining tax reform and health care in the same reconciliation bill, will make them both far more difficult to enact for two reasons. First, a tax/healthcare reconciliation bill will require that all of the tax provisions from both be combined in a single piece of legislation that would likely be so controversial that it would be incapable of being enacted. I mean, there'll be almost universal Democratic opposition to it, I would imagine, if not absolute from day one Democratic opposition to it. You can never tell with some Democrats. But it's pretty clear that, they think they've come out on the winning side on fighting the Affordable Care Act repeal and replace fight. And in all likelihood, the Democratic the Republican tax reform package is going to be a piece of garbage. Every draft of it is awful. So the likelihood of combining the two and finding any Democratic support on it is, I would guess, at zero. If you want to hedge it, you could say near zero. And the chances of holding the Republican caucus together on it are pretty low, too. There will be so-called moderates, or people who want to position themselves as moderate, who will say either the healthcare repeal part is too drastic, or the tax cut part is too drastic, or some combination of both. And then, of course, there'll be the Freedom Caucus guys who say either both or neither one are drastic enough. We need to cut taxes. The effective tax rate in this country should be negative 4 billion%. Everybody should pay over, everybody should just get free money from the government, except that's socialism. But in this case, it's a tax refund on taxes you never paid, and so therefore it's a good thing. They could probably get away with that. And as Bill points out just now, through his magic morning tweet, not our kickoff tweet, which was a very good one this morning, but I can't backtrack now. It's too late. But he points out Nancy Pelosi has this pesky habit of keeping her caucus together. That's true. And in the Senate, likely to happen as well. I don't know if it's developed into a habit yet with Chuck Schumer, but he hasn't had to develop much of a habit. They're pretty well conditioned to rejecting the Trump agenda at this point, but it never hurts to whip them a little bit. All right. So, Collender said first, a combo bill would, of course, be extraordinarily controversial and incapable of being enacted. Second, the Senate would have to comply with both the healthcare and tax instructions, or the bill wouldn't meet reconciliation rules and so would be subject to a filibuster. Now, that seems obvious, but let's just remind ourselves that the piece of garbage Swiss cheese that came back after the bird bath on their first pass at ACA repeal was a total disaster. But it was, in fact, I guess if you really count everything, it was their 70-something attempt at Affordable Care Act repeal. But even just in this Congress, they drafted and redrafted again, and did it all in secret and basically allowed Mitch McConnell and his staff to do the whole thing. And Mr. Tactician still couldn't get it together and come back with a bill that repealed the Affordable Care Act and could even muster enough Republican votes to get it done, even with a majority. So, the likelihood of being able to do that on both healthcare and taxes would be pretty slim. I'll have to agree on that point. Where were we? It says, not only would it be difficult to get both past the reconciliation rules, but anyway, it would end up making tax reform the second stab at a big, huge top priority for the Trump administration. It would make that effort totally dependent on agreement to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act that has so far been unreachable. If they're both in the same bill, then it's you got your choice of either taxes or healthcare or both on which to base your rejection of the bill. Now, I guess one thing so far that hasn't been answered is why they couldn't simply just run two reconciliation bills, both of which comply with the instructions, but just not compile them into an omnibus reconciliation bill. And there I think we're getting into, then we get into the problem of this belief that's been in circulation that reconciliation can only be used once a year. That's just not right. But I don't think it gets addressed in this article. The only other options, he writes, would be for the Senate to eliminate the legislative filibuster. That's out there. So that health care could be enacted with a simple majority, something that Majority Leader Mitch McConnell so far has shown no interest in doing. Or for Congress to pass a second budget resolution with separate reconciliation instructions for tax or health care after work on the first reconciliation was completed. So, so that kind of addresses it. Stan here appears to be saying that only one reconciliation bill can come out of a single budget resolution's either he may be saying that only one reconciliation bill per budget resolution, or he may be saying that certain kinds of instructions can only produce one reconciliation bill, but that they can come back and pass a second budget resolution with separate reconciliation instructions for one or the other of the two agenda items after the first reconciliation bill was completed. Either way, it does, I think, represent an endorsement of the idea that, yeah, sure, you can do more than one reconciliation bill in a year. I don't know why we fight about this, because if you just look at the history of the use of reconciliation, there's a couple sites that'll show you that and tell you which years did they use reconciliation bills, and you will find at least one example on the list of reconciliation bills being passed twice in a single calendar year. So there's the answer, right? But we don't look that stuff up for whatever reason. And I don't remember offhand what year it was. And I should, but I don't. So anyway, I think that sort of resolves the issue of whether or not you can do reconciliation more than once in a year. What would it take to pass a second budget resolution, though? That might be above and beyond the capabilities of this Republican Congress. But a tightly managed ship, you'd be able to do it. Like Nancy Pelosi, she could do it. And then, of course, Republicans would run around saying, this is an outrage. No one has ever used reconciliation more than once in a single year. Well, of course people have. Well, when they did it, it was terrible. Well, you did it. Oh, well, when we did it, it was great. But this thing is horrible. Oh, okay. Sure. We should look that up. We might as well. We'll do that. Maybe we'll do that research on air. But first, let's finish with Stan Collender here so he can go home. Of course, Congress hasn't shown it's willing to adopt one fiscal 2018 budget resolution to this point. The deadline was last April, let alone two. By the way, once again, one of those deadlines, it's like, who cares, right? I mean, if they come up with a budget and they have, and they move it to the floor, I don't know, this week, next week, and they pass it, there's nobody standing in the way to say, yeah, the deadline was April. That's the usual time period in which these things are passed, but nobody gives a good goddamn, so why should you? Trump's second big legislative setback, Stan concludes here, came when the White House surprisingly announced that the president was backing off on his demand that funding for the wall he wants to build between the United States and Mexico had to be included in the legislation that will need to be enacted by October 1st to avoid a government shutdown. It was surprising because less than 2 weeks earlier, Trump promised at his rally in Arizona, it says, see the video clip below, but I don't think I even see a video clip below, and I don't care, I don't want to see it, that he absolutely would shut down the government if he didn't get the funds he wanted. And we all remember how ridiculous that was. I mean, the demand itself, I'm going to shut down the government unless you, the taxpayers, pay for the wall that I promised you Mexico was going to pay for. Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, he's still trying to explain that one away by saying, well, they'll pay us back. But they're not going to. Anyway, it doesn't matter because we're not going to put up the money for the wall in the first place. But there we go. So he's reversed course on that. Now, the next bit of thinking here is that he may have, or maybe in the process of reversing himself on DACA, or sort of reversing himself, or tying himself up in some sort of knots anyway. Big, bold announcement, I'm going to do this thing and we're going to get rid of DACA. And then I think within the same 24-hour period, it became, it's going to be, I'm going to repeal DACA or suspend it, or however you would refer to it when you're talking about undoing an executive order from a previous administration. But the deal was, I'm going to undo it on a 6-month delay, which, no one knows what that's supposed to mean. And, of course, there's plenty of time for things to change. But it's shaped up, it sounds like, in this way, as though he were going to announce, well, I'm going to do it in 6 months unless Congress acts before then. And there's a very convoluted argument that they're making that would sort of kind of justify doing it that way. The basis for, the legal basis for undoing DACA among Republicans is that President Obama overstepped his constitutional authority and overstepped constitutional bounds in, I'm sorry, timeout. I should not be looking at Twitter. But I just have to point out that I've seen now someone is tweeting a screen capture of a local television news broadcast for WWAY3, whatever that channel is. If you know where it is, then maybe you'll know what we're talking about. Doing the weather, and the weather lady is up there and putting up the notes for the weather for the week. And you know how people who, I don't know, either just love saying this or love that commercial with the camel in it and love referring to Wednesday as hump day, right? Well, she's giving the weather, telling everybody how's the rest of the week going to go. Is it going to rain on Wednesday? No, because Wednesday you'll have it says right up on the screen, dry hump day. Okay, language, you're not going to want to do it that way. That's just bad thinking, and the editor didn't get a good look at that one. Okay, well that's a nice distraction from the dry topic of the budget, and well, not quite so dry topic of DACA, but we'll get back to that because now this little graphic of laughing at the graphic of dry hump day got me again. Has got us up against our first break, for which we'll play our fantastic outro music and let you know we'll be back in 2 minutes after this break for station identification. Okay, hey, welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show right here on Netroots Radio and Daily Coast Radio. I ought to give ourselves some credit about that, although I'm the only program on Daily Coast Radio. So sometimes I include myself under the much larger umbrella of Netroots Radio, which, by the way, you should be turning into at midnight. Everyone should tuning into all day long. And if you don't know how, we'll teach you. If you're listening on terrestrial radio, or otherwise, for that matter, on podcast, and for some reason you don't know how to tune in to the show which follows us daily, the after show, which I love to promote what they've got coming up, and they always bat clean up. You can be sure that if we obsess on one story or another, that you can be sure that they'll check into everything, and they'll be looking at the headlines, and they will cover things when we get too obsessive about them. But you can find them at Netroots. It's easy enough, right? Netrootsradio.com, and you can check out the entire lineup and find out where they do their live streaming and click in and listen at any time wherever you are, because of course it streams via the internet. So let's say you are with our friends in Rochester at WRFZ 106.3 on your FM dial, and you say, I would like to hear Wink and Justice bat cleanup on this issue and bring my attention to stories that might have been skipped on the first go-round, but I can't because they're not on WRFZ. Well, why not? I don't know. Maybe we can work that out. But in the meantime, here's how you can fix it. Just go to netrootsradio.com and click on the player and listen in that way. Easy enough to do, and I encourage you all to do it. Now, back to our story, not about Dry Hump Day, which I did retweet to those of you who might be wondering if you could get in on the joke, but rather back to the story of DACA and how the president thinks he's going to deal with it. Recalling the storyline behind his insistence that it needs to be undone is that Republicans feel like that President Obama overstepped his authority in implementing the program. Originally, this was something that was taken up as legislation, introduced in Congress, and for many years it was introduced and it simply went nowhere. But finally, after 2010 and in through 2010, 11, 12, Did it go further than that? We can take a look at the legislative history. But at last, it did come to a vote in Congress, and the results were, of course, disappointing. They did get 55 votes for it in the Senate, and it did pass the House. But, of course, as you know, 55 out of 100 is not enough to pass legislation in Congress, and sometimes we're thankful for that, and sometimes we're not. And it was rather disappointing because, of course, that meant that there were not a whole lot, but a handful of Democrats who voted no the last time there was a chance to codify the DACA policy but in legislation and not have to resort to doing it by executive authority. And I guess by way of the most basic possible explanation of DACA, we are, of course, talking about a deferred action on any immigration status activity like getting deported. That's the important one. For people who were brought to the United States as children, as minor children, presumably without any control over where they were going, by parents who may have immigrated illegally, and who have since, of course, stayed out of trouble and are basically living the American dream as best they can and working and paying taxes and going to school and doing all the sorts of things you need to do to get prepared for a successful life according to the gospel of the American dream, and hence dreamers. And anyway, this was rejected legislatively by a vote of 55 votes in the Senate because of the filibuster. They didn't get enough votes to invoke cloture, and that was the end of it. So it was President Obama who said, well, maybe there's some executive action I can take. If, after all, what we're talking about is deporting people, and that's executive action, I can simply say, let's suspend that action when it comes to people who meet the definition of the dreamers that the legislation would have deferred action on. But Republicans were of the opinion that unless it was done legislatively, a simple executive order on the subject wasn't enough to get the job done. And so they are objecting now that it is unconstitutional, the DACA program, because it was done by executive fiat, as they like to say. And so it's just Donald Trump looking out for the interests of the Constitution. I love the Constitution so much that I just can't stand to see it violated here. And we're going to have to undo it. And we may redo it in constitutional fashion. We may end the executive fiat on DACA, but hand it over to Congress to do what they should have done a long time ago and enshrine this legislatively. However, of course, this Congress, not capable of doing anything, including writing their own instructions for the bills they say they want to pass, much less doing something like this, which most Republicans don't really want to do anyway. So let's see. We got a couple of interesting things we can do on that. Let me bring you up to speed on, let's see. We've got some background pieces, some of which Greg has sent us. Let's see. We've got this piece here. Oh, wait a minute. There's something else in the other column in my KITM column as well. Information thread on DACA, and then an article from Politico. Let's see. The Politico piece, where is that? Did that open up here? Yeah. Fight over dreamers to test Bannon's juice outside the White House. Remember that Stephen Bannon? Yeah. He left the White House. We all remember that. And then, of course, he left with one of those Sarah Palin lines about how he would be more effective from the outside. So maybe this is the first test of that. At least that's how it's being framed here in this Politico piece by Eliana Johnson, Josh Dawsey, and Andrew Restuccia. Hope I got that right. With Trump largely punting the DACA decision to Congress, Bannon is ready for combat with GOP leaders. And you know what? It's illustrated with a picture, fairly current picture, I would think, from back when he was in the White House. Stephen K. Bannon is not ready for combat. Just want to put that out there. Before strategist Stephen Bannon's departure, and it's generous to call him a strategist, but that's the label they put on him. Before his departure from the White House last month, and again, if he was much of a strategist, he would have been able to strategize avoiding getting his ass kicked out of the White House. But okay, he wanted to spend more time with his dissolved hot tub. Before he left, aides to President Donald Trump quietly worried what kind of damage he would inflict from the outside. Oh, look at this. Armando is ready to test our echo. I hear my own echo. We'll see whether Armando hears anything. Armando.
I don't hear it on my phone, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
No, but that's a good thing. I don't know. We'll have to hear whether people on the stream hear it. All of a sudden, I become very echoey. Maybe we'll hear if they hear that. If they don't hear that, I can live with it.
All right. As long as it makes sense. Half a loaf better than none, right?
Yes.
Anyway, you're talking about DACA. I didn't want to interrupt. I do want to give you some thoughts I have on it.
Okay.
Or you were talking about DACA when I called in.
Yes, and I still am. Let's interrupt.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I will interrupt at some point, but I know you were going through the details.
Okay. Well, I wasn't, but I don't.
Well,
go ahead.
I can give you my thoughts then if you want.
Yes, please do.
All right. There's a couple of things about what Trump is doing today. You know, on human terms, we know it's horrible and awful. 800,000 people who won't be able to live their lives as they were living them before.
Right.
Working, going to school, etc. So it's a terrible thing. It's a mean thing. It's a bigoted thing. All the things we've come to associate with Donald Trump. But I was struck by as you were mentioning previously, the argument that, you know, it's unconstitutional or that this is too much power for the executive. Now, I don't know how often, if ever, the executive branch has actually said, I've got too much power. And it's really, I think, pretty clearly a ruse to try to make it seem that it's not a bigoted act.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea that
in service of white supremacy.
The idea that, like, you know, Mr. Emoluments is suddenly concerned about the integrity of the Constitution is pretty obviously ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. And even in the immigration framework, one of the main arguments in support of the travel ban is the Muslim travel ban was that the president has unfettered power in the area of immigration.
Yeah, they've argued that for a long time.
Right. Well, I'm just saying this is contrary to that. Now, remember, in the travel ban case, there are actually statutes that the travel ban violates beyond the Constitution. Congress has legislated that you can't take into account race, ethnicity, religion, etc. And, of course, that's what the travel ban does. So, yeah, it's certainly not a consistent point of view. I do want to return to the arguments that we talked about when DAPA was being challenged in El Paso due to forum shopping by the state of Texas. And they drew the judge, whose name escapes me, Andrew Kanan, I think. That could be wrong, but I think it's close. And the recognition of state standing on this.
Okay.
Now, you know that the excuse, why is it happening today? Well, state of Texas again said that if you don't undo DACA, I'm suing.
Yes, right.
All right. So, again, it's premised on the notion that states have standing here, which they don't, even though courts said they did. My disgust with standing theory as promulgated by the Supreme Court is a matter of record. It's just made up. They decided since someone doesn't have standing when they don't want them to have standing, they decide they do when they do. It's completely unprincipled in every respect. And it's the excuse, though. I mean, if there's a lawsuit, there's a lawsuit. Maybe they get an injunction. Well, find out. Let the court be the one that tells you can't. I assume they'd
Yes.
sue again in El Paso, and they'd go to the same judge and count on getting the same victory. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they would. But all of this is nonsense, and it's striking that Trump himself will not make the announcement, even though he tweeted about it today.
Right, handing that off to Sessions, who says he won't take any questions at the announcement.
I just think the optics of that is also fascinating. Sessions, of all people, to do it. I mean, a man who is known to be a racist. It's not a secret.
True.
I mean, yeah, I guess in polite company people don't say that, but we all know he's a racist. If we know anything about Jeff Sessions, it's that he's a racist.
Yes, that and that he lied to Congress when he was at his confirmation hearings.
He lied about not being a racist.
That too. He lied about a lot of things.
Yeah. I know you were talking about other lies, but that particular lies also was a lie.
Well, once he opened the door, he went for a twofer. I'm lying now. It's perjury one way or another. I might as well get it all in.
Might as well get it all in. So anyway, what the optics of having Sessions do the announcement, not take questions. I mean, I'm sort of surprised he didn't have Sheriff Joe come in and do it. It would have been almost similar in its optics, which everyone was talking about optics because Trump did what a normal human being does. He went certainly any president would do. Went to a shelter in Houston and talked to people.
Yes.
Wow, now he became president.
He autographed it. Did you see that? He signed the wall. I'm not sure why he did that.
I mean, I don't even get it. I mean, what does that even mean? Oh, well, look how great he was. What did it mean? He didn't do anything. He did standard issue nothing. Look, I think it's important presidents do that, but I certainly don't get brownie points for it. It's a bare minimum.
Yes.
That he had to do it over.
That's true.
Is the problem. He had to do it twice.
Yes.
But I'm just curious if any reporter will talk about the optics of having Jefferson Beauregard Sessions do the DACA announcement. Remember that it is Stephen Miller, a Sessions aide, first lent to the Trump campaign. I remember telling you about Stephen Miller when I went to a Trump rally last March.
Oh, yes, that's right.
2016. Stephen Miller gave the most racist speech you could imagine.
That's right. You did fill us in on that.
And, of course, he's lived up to the billing. That's what he is every time you see him. That's what Jeff Sessions is. And, of course, that's what Donald Trump is. But if the idea was, well, I don't want to fight for DACA, and you say you want to throw it to Congress, optics, having Jeff Sessions do the announcement isn't exactly what I would do. Now, even if he says, well, we're doing it because it's unconstitutional. Well, we know that's not why he's doing it.
Right.
We know that's not why he is.
Right. Like he's firing Comey because he was mean to Hillary, and I'm doing this because it's unconstitutional.
Right. I mean, he's doing it. Certainly Sessions and Miller will oppose DACA. They'll urge the president to veto a DACA bill.
Yes, that's true, too.
What DACA bill will he sign? Is he going to insist that there be payments for the wall in the DACA bill?
Yeah, maybe. I love the way that this has been so interesting to have them. How I put it yesterday, there, Trump University splaining the Constitution to the rest of us. The Trump University Law School graduates here that it's unconstitutional. You see, because President exceeded his authority. In the same way that I exceeded my authority with the Muslim ban. These are the same advisors, none of whom are actually lawyers, telling him about, we're going to use the excuse of this constitutionality. I'll explain it all to you over, $60 steaks at the Trump Hotel downtown, and we'll rent a golf cart to get there too. So he's out of his mind.
And talk about how it's not constitutional. That would actually be perfect, to be honest with you. But Yeah, so they're going to say that. And you know what? There is a colorable argument on constitutionality. I just don't think anybody has standing to make it.
That may be. Greg Sargent did a good piece this morning, kind of rounding all of that up and pointing out, doing a good job of pointing out, there's a real argument to be had here. It's just you take those things to court and let judges make those decisions. You don't just let Trump University explain everything and say, well, I don't know, I think it's unconstitutional, but what do I know? I just autographed the wall. So.
Well, this goes back to standing issues. I mean, there's lots of things. Can we go to court for the emoluments case? I mean, I know there's court cases, but I believe they're probably going to fail on standing.
Yeah, they might. We'll try that when we go to the DACA thing. Your Honor, while I have your attention, this is another matter I wanted to bring up. It's not on the docket.
As long as we're talking about unconstitutionality, the president is breaking the emoluments clause, both the domestic and foreign. Maybe you can do something about that, too.
Right. And then, I know it's not in the docket, it's not in the pleadings, but I mean, the Constitution is at stake here, guy. Come on.
Yeah.
You going to turn your back on it?
The Constitution is in here and constitutional. Therefore, you should address all constitutional issues now.
It's all in the same document.
Exactly. But look, I mean, standing has been used to cabin these types of inquiries. They're considered political questions. They're considered something that the courts shouldn't address, that it's not their business. Let the other branches of government work it out.
Yeah.
How many times have you heard that? Well, then, of course, they've decided that a single branch of Congress gets to sue, too. And that's how the CSR payments became an issue. I just have, I'm actually the person, probably a lawyer with the least respect for court system in America.
Maybe.
It just all seems it's all nonsense. They just make it up. They want a result, they make it up. Yes, there's a school of thought. You've heard it as well. Legal realism. That's, I think, a very accurate portrayal of what happens in the court systems. With guardrails, generally you can't completely jump off the rails, but within the pathway, they're allowed so much to do, so many ways of deciding things and that's exactly what they do. And this will be another example of that. Here, of course, Trump is going to use that as an excuse to say, well, I can't, I have to repeal DACA because it's unconstitutional. And I have too much power. I've got to give it back.
Not very Trump-like.
Not very Trump-like. And Jeff Sessions will announce it, and that's very weird. I mean, Trump can't talk, so I guess that there's something to having someone who can at least mouth the right words on these constitutional questions. Trump certainly couldn't, but that's not why he's not doing it. He doesn't want to be seen as the guy who's against DACA for whatever reason.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that is exactly, although there are some working theories out there, but it seems clear that he wants a way to wiggle out of doing this, which is amazing given how he campaigned and what he promised, but it's only one of several things that he reversed himself entirely on in the course of a few months. So maybe it's not unusual in that sense, but I think that's pretty easily identifiable as one of his top issues.
Well, yeah. Well, Javanka is out there saying that she opposes repealing DACA.
Yes, right. But she's on vacation in Nepal and can't help.
It's just an interesting play. I mean, I actually don't think there's an easy play for Trump, and to throw it to the Republicans in Congress is actually kind of stupid on his part in this sense. He's not up for re-election in 2018. His base forgives him everything. If they do reinstate DACA through the legislative process after he repeals it, they'll say, well, Trump didn't do it. Those 30 Republicans did, and we're not voting for them. And that helps Democrats in 2018, frankly.
I'll take it.
So
if it happens.
The reality is this is one of those things where the president, in theory, politically and historically, is taking the punch because he can. You don't want to throw it on your colleagues in the Congress for a number of reasons. One, of course, is you don't want them to lose seats. The other is they'll owe you one when you want them to give you something different. But that's not Trump.
Right. Well, he doesn't understand
and
that.
That's
stuff.
certainly not the people around him.
No.
So it's a fascinating development. The reconciliation questions are important, and I don't know if you've gotten to it or if you've been following it. There has been some reporting on their tax reform efforts. My favorite proposal they have so far is to cut the corporate tax rate, but to fund that corporate tax rate cut, take away tax deductibility of 401k contributions.
What is that about exactly?
Well, they need it, if they want to do it, it's under reconciliation. It has to be deficit neutral, right? Or relatively deficit neutral. And sure, you can do gimmicks and have things expire in 10 years, but you still have to find, even in the short term, money to do it. Now, they'll get some with repatriation, which apparently is something they're going to do.
Is that back?
Or thinking of doing. Pardon?
That's back again?
Yeah.
Huh.
Repatriation it's going to be an income source. I mean, it's going to be a revenue source. So they can fund other tax cuts. And remember, they'll have stuff that expires and sunsets in 10 years. So when they can qualify into the CBO scoring. But I just thought the optics of that, if we're talking about optics again, since optics seems to be so important, what about the optics of cutting the deductibility of 401k contributions, which is something middle-class Americans do? Of course, upper-class Americans also, but middle-class Americans do 401k contributions. And expressly saying we're doing this to fund a cut in the corporate tax rate.
Those
How
would
does
be
that
bad
fit the
optics.
economic anxiety, drain the swamp theories? What are the optics of that?
The optics are, I'm already elected. Bye.
Well, I'm just asking it more as a media question. Shouldn't the media be saying, wow, this is a terrible optics move by Trump? Because they like to talk in terms of optics. At least talk about it in terms of optics.
Yeah. Well, I think what's becoming clear is optics is what you talk about when the subject matter, the substance is either unassailable or over your head. So you go to optics in a normal situation because, the dry details of a real president's policy, can't be dissected by everybody. And very often the journalists find they can't understand it or get their head around it. So they talk about the optics and whether it's a win. Here, the substance is very often so facially stupid and ridiculous that they just spend their time ridiculing it, and then they're right on point.
Well, I don't know. It just seems to me that's, they have such an optics thing. That would have been an interesting optics story for them to cover, and they love covering from supporters. Ask them about that.
Oh, that's true. They could tour the country and ask them about the optics.
Ask them, what do you think of Trump's plan to cut the corporate tax rate and make you pay more, more in taxes, so that they can fund that tax cut for corporations?
Yeah. And then we can print. All 10 of them said fake news.
Fair enough, but ask them. I mean, you want to cover them so badly, ask them.
I guess so. In case you're at a loss for what to do.
I'll play by your rules, but let's play by your rules then. Play by the rules, your coverage rules, in every aspect.
That's very boring.
Look, Trump supporters, the 34% who the
34%?
The 34% who oppose DACA.
Okay.
Are the same 34% who support Trump. I mean,
yes.
That's where we are now, isn't it?
I would think so.
I mean, this whole optics thing there? Yeah, there was always deplorables. That's the whole point.
Yes.
And that's who you're left with. So when you go out and talk to them, ask them. They will tell you, I'm very much in favor of cutting the corporate tax rate. I'm very much opposed to DACA. I'm very much for the wall. I'm very much for the Muslim ban.
Yes,
I'm
some
very
of them will
much
say
for
that.
keeping the Confederate monuments up. It's the same 34%.
Although there is a rotating cast now, and there's another hot genre out there of Trump supporters who are personally offended by today's outrage. That is, there were a number of, we've got all the stories of, well, I was a Trump supporter, but I didn't really think he was going to take away my health care. Now it turns out that's the case, and I hope he'll do the right thing. I think he's just doing this for effect and whatever. And now the newest round of things is people who voted for him and are being deported and saying, I didn't think he was going to get me. I didn't think he meant people like me. I'm productive. All right.
Yeah,
well,
I don't know what they were thinking, and they're my people, and they were stupid.
well,
I have no explanation or excuse for them. If they thought that, then they weren't thinking. I mean,
well, that seems clear enough.
That
It's
seems clear
getting
enough.
close to our next break, so we'll wind things up here. And thank you very much for testing out our Skype. I think we can minimize the echo a little bit, and hopefully we're on our way to a cure. If you want to hang on through the
Okay.
break, that would be fine, but we'll be back after this short break for station identification, just 1 minute, and we'll be back again with more. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio and Daily Coast Radio and Radio Free Rochester too, by the way, WRFZ 106.3 FM in Rochester. Still talking here with Armando. Just a few more thoughts on DACA. I'm going to continue on the subject for a little while, but we do have more to bring you. It's a jam-packed day, week, administration, however you want to term it. Where were we when we left off, though, Armando?
Well, I did want to touch just on one thing. What's the end game here? I would assume Trump. I do think this is the case. He's looking to get a deal where Congress passes DACA, but also funds or partially funds his wall. A down payment, as they say, it might be $5 billion or $8 billion. I know a lot. I've seen the reaction is no deal. I think it depends on a couple of things. Number one, if it's, basically just funding existing, because there's an existing fences and things like that need probably some attention, just maintenance and whatnot. And if the number's small enough, and if all he wants is a symbolic victory, frankly, I'd give him one myself. It's easy for me to say. I don't have to face voters.
Right.
But I just think the 800,000 DACA recipients, their lives are, need to be stabilized. They need to continue to be living their lives in the productive ways that they're trying to do now. So to me, there's a deal that you could strike and even give Trump a PR win, because at the end of the day, he wants the wall. We want DACA.
Right.
And I'd go to the ballot box with that. Myself.
Yeah, I think there's probably room in there. You don't want to discuss it too much because there'll be, of course, backlash,
of course,
et cetera. But yeah, I mean, especially if, as you point out, the wall part of the victory is really, well, we replaced some rusting bolts on fencing that already existed, and he says it's a win.
There is a wall now. I mean, it's not a wall. It's fences. It's this and that. There can't be a wall. The reality is we can't have a 5,000-mile wall. It's
right.
Or
Even he concedes
whatever,
this from time to time.
2,500-mile wall. It's not feasible. It's not realistic. So he just wants the illusion of a wall. Give him an illusion of a down payment for a wall in exchange for securing the rights of the of 800,000 DACA recipients. I think there's a deal you can make, and I understand the bargaining posture. You definitely say no now, but I don't know. At the end of the day, this is a bit of a deal, and it's a deal with the devil. But 800,000 lives at stake.
Pull 800,000 people onto the lifeboat. That's good.
Right. I just see it that way, and I'll be curious to see what the Republican Congress's posture is. Now, everyone I've heard from, up to and including Tom Cotton, says they want DACA. Now, Cotton has some cockamamie improve benefit American workers or something. I don't know what that means exactly. I mean, he's certainly not asking for a raise in the minimum wage. So who knows what those Orwellian words mean from Cotton, but he's for DACA legislation. So that means, frankly, who is it? I guess maybe Ted Cruz and some, but you certainly
Steve
get
King.
at least 12 to 15 Republicans, it seems to me. Flake and McCain and Graham and Collins and Murkowski, and I'm sure you can count up to 12 to 15, and particularly if McConnell says, okay, let's do a deal. Ryan said he wants to do it. Freedom Caucus, who knows what they do, but Ryan can bring it to the floor. I mean, I guess if he wants cover, he can permit a discharge petition and do it that way, and say it's not my doing, and I got overruled by the body. Not that anyone would necessarily believe that, but I guess it could happen that way, right?
Yeah, it's possible.
And then you pass it, and they make a deal, and frankly, it's important. And once it's codified, frankly, DACA becomes very valuable even going forward. I mean, I'm sure more people will come out, and you'll be talking about 1.5 million DACA recipients. So that's it's tough. It's tough to govern. It's not fun to have to give in to people who are bad in order to do something good, but sometimes that's what you have to do. So I hope people will be more understanding if and when that moment comes when that kind of deal gets struck.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I think we can probably prepare our corner of the world for it, depending on what the deal actually is. But yeah, there will be people who fight about it, consider it a sellout, etc. And there will also be in the neighborhood of 1 million people who consider it to have saved their lives.
Exactly. I think that number is what's key here. Anyway, David, I'm going to let you get back to the rest of your show. Thanks for letting me share my thoughts.
Certainly.
And I hope the echoes are few and far between.
We hope so. Thanks very much, Armando. I do have more to follow up with on the DACA issue, and we'll see whether the echo now goes away on my voice now that the Skype is disconnected, and help diagnose our problems here. But hopefully it wasn't too bad for those of you listening to the live stream. If it really gets horrible, do try and let us know, and we can try and limit things. But I was muting my microphone, which you probably heard the button even once in a while clicking on and off. But I was hoping that by muting the microphone in between my own comments, that would help minimize the feedback effect for building the echo. All right, everybody gives me thumbs up that the echo is gone now that the call is ended. It's clearly Skype or any of the other audio programs that we use to pipe in additional audio sources, and I mean that does sort of help narrow things down. But still, all of these systems we've built they're built properly. There shouldn't be any place where the audio can feed back on itself. But at least it was minimized, so I'm glad for that. Now the next test is, can I play video? I know that the auto playing video is always a problem for me, and now I intentionally want to play some video, and we'll see whether we can get it on there properly. Did you see these things that Andrew Kaczynski came up with? I guess I can read a write-up of it just to make sure that we at least have the gist of it with some quotes from the video, lest my video playback ability be compromised. Law News has this piece. Alberto Luperon has this summary of it. It's a flashback. Trump says it's wrong to deport immigrant families. This is a very interesting clip for a number of reasons, not the least of which, of course, is it is Donald Trump in his own voice calling his favorite program, Fox and Friends, a couple years back, and essentially, he's taking the position that could roughly be translated into the idea of that suspending, that ending the DACA program now would be horribly wrong, immoral, I guess would be a better term for it, and politically disastrous. And this is only in about 2012. I'm not positive of the date here, and maybe the write-up has it, but they seem to be discussing the positions being taken by Republican candidates during the 2012 campaign, and I guess the primary campaign, unless we're talking about post-primary Newt Gingrich criticizing Mitt Romney, which, could have happened. But anyway, he's calling into, actually, I think the first one is from MSNBC. It might not even be Fox and Friends. But Kaczynski found two clips, one on Fox News and one on MSNBC. And let's see if we can... Which one should we play first? Let me look at the Law News write-up of it so that we can get the background and the gist of it. Not too long ago, immigration hardliner President Donald Trump said it was wrong to deport immigrant families who have been in the United States for years. And I don't know, should I bother imitating his voice? Maybe I can try and roll it first. Here's the two clips. Maybe I can roll this one. This is the MSNBC one. Is that the shorter one or the longer one? This is a shorter one here that they used embedded in this piece. Let's just roll that one. This is from MSNBC.
As an example, you have people in this country for 20 years. They've done a great job. They've done wonderfully. They've gone to school. They've gotten good marks. They're productive. Now we're supposed to send them out of the country? I don't believe in that, Michelle, and you understand that. I don't believe in a lot of things that are being said.
That's a pretty short little clip there, just 16 seconds. But, I mean, it pretty well nails down that Donald Trump has done a 180 and maybe is doing another 180 on this program right before our very eyes. It says here in the Law News write-up, this wasn't a one-off. Trump said something similar on Fox and Friends. How do you tell a family who have been here 25 years to get out? He said. When announcing his candidacy in 2015, Trump said most Mexicans who came to the United States were criminals. As president, he's actually carried through with this hardline attitude. ICE officials are now going after even undocumented who've committed no crimes. More recently in the news, in his new policy on DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the Obama-era policy shielded... I've misemphasized here, but more recently in the news is his new policy on DACA. The Obama-era policy shielded some young undocumented immigrants from deportation. Proponents say that these people who came to the States as children have no real link back to their birth nations. The policy affects almost 800,000 people nationwide. A Politico report from Sunday said he had decided to end it with a 6-month delay so Congress can handle the fallout with legislation. But there's been no official policy change yet. The White House has scheduled an announcement, of course, for Tuesday. We discussed that. It's going to be Jeff Sessions doing it. Up to now, Trump has been pretty vague about how he'll handle DACA, telling Fox News in January that his policy will be firm, but will have a lot of heart, whatever that is supposed to mean. Now, Kaczynski also found this longer clip. This one is clearly from the 2012 campaign. Up on the screen, the chyron reads, Michelle Bachmann. Bachmann calls out Gingrich, shows 2004 amnesty letter on Fox and Friends. So at this point in the 2012 campaign, Bachmann's still in the running, Gingrich still in the running, and of course Mitt Romney still in the running, and they're criticizing one another on their immigration stances, and the hardliners are undercutting one another, saying, you didn't used to be so hard line about it. Another, by the way, interesting clip circulating a lot over the last couple of days, over the long weekend, was from 1980, the 1980 primaries debate between George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. And I didn't get a chance to listen to the clip, but I did see how it was being framed, which was, you can listen to Reagan and Bush debate over which of the two of them will be the more compassionate toward immigrant families. And we've come a long way, I guess, is what we were supposed to find out about this one. Let me roll this other piece here. I got to bring this up. I'll roll it back one more time. We'll start over again. It starts early on me because of the autoplay. But this is the Fox and Friends segment we were talking about. It's slightly longer.
You asked Michelle to actually physically go across the street and tell the family of 25 years to get out of this country, she wouldn't do it because she's a good person.
But here's the problem with Mitt Romney in this situation. He came out and say it's a magnet and he disagrees. But in 2007, he was calling for the same exact thing. Newt Gingrich fired back and said, here's your clip from Meet the Press from 3 years ago. Does that bother you?
Well, actually, he didn't strongly disagree. And, in fact, a lot of people are really curious as to when he'll say something because I just saw something on television where they were saying that he really has.
By the way, of course he just saw something on television. But by the way, before I even continue rolling, have you noticed how much more together and mentally focused Trump sounds? He's still not, 100% like he used to be. Well, he was never 100%, I guess. But back in the 90s, when we, for instance, listened to him testifying before Congress, he was considerably more eloquent. But he's really got it together in terms of responding quickly and cogently to the objections being made by the hosts here. Let me just continue to roll. I'll pop it back a little bit and we'll pick it up again.
Saying that he really hasn't taken a stance or a very strong stance yet, and he hasn't said anything about what Newt said. So let's see what he says. But look, this is a matter of this isn't conservative. I'm the world's most conservative person.
Yeah,
this isn't conservative. This is compassion.
Is it amnesty?
I guess to a certain extent, for a very limited number of people, it would be considered amnesty. But how do you tell a family that's been here for 25 years to get out?
That's tough.
Or if their kids are born here, they stay, the parents leave, and that's what
Right.
Newt Gingrich's contention
Right.
is. How can you be the party that's pro-family and dividing the family, but
So cogent answers from Trump, and I guess by extension there's also cogent answers having been given in 2012 by Newt Gingrich, too. I wouldn't be surprised to see if he flip-flops again in between then and now. But pretty amazing, and for a number of reasons, not the least of which is he actually sounds like he has his act together, sort of, Donald Trump. I mean, he still wasn't qualified to be president in 2012 or even at the height of whatever mental acuity he has. But it's very striking. And then, of course, the position itself and the passion with which he argues it, too. How do you tell a family that's been here 25 years to get out? Well, you found out pretty quick, because when you were on the campaign trail, you found out that people were yelling and screaming and getting ready to throw things at you if you didn't tell a family that's been here 25 years. Family, they're Mexicans. Who cares? And so all of a sudden, he switches positions on that one. Pretty amazing. You're not going to change his mind to go back, I'm sure. But I guess, if anything, if there's anything credible about what's going on now with the way the president is handling DACA, I suppose these sorts of clips maybe lend some credibility to the story, which I otherwise don't really want to credit, that Trump is hemming and hawing on DACA and giving a 6-month delay and not doing the announcement himself because he really is somehow torn on this particular issue. But, I mean, then why pick DACA first? Why not deal with some other aspect of immigration first and get it right? But maybe he can't. Maybe he has no interest in it. Maybe he just thought this would be easy. Maybe he thought the cover of constitutionality would help. Maybe he has no effing idea whatsoever, but Stephen Miller told him, yeah, I want to do DACA first because it's the cruelest. And in that sense, that would fit very well with, regular alt-right ideology. We want to do the most outrageous, most controversial, cruelest thing first and stick it in the eye of every decent person there is, because we can. And then they'll fear what else we might do. And that seems to be sort of the alt-right way of doing things in general. Anyway, I just thought that was pretty amazing that was out there. And Kaczynski is really great at doing that, although it was funny watching him comment on it. He just says, I feel like he's credited for finding all these fantastic hypocrisies on tape, and he should be credited because it's hard work, generally speaking, and he's really good at it, and he's just one of those naturals at it, I guess, because he was commenting on it on Twitter yesterday and just saying, it's funny, I feel like whenever Trump does anything, says anything, I feel like if I just open the video archives of him to a random page and play it, I will find a giant hypocrisy, essentially. I don't remember exactly how he said it, but, you still have to dig up the video archive on him, but there's plenty. He's a publicity hog, so he's all over the place. Eventually you'll come up. Just like there's a tweet for everything, there's probably a video clip for everything. It's just not as searchable as Twitter is. Anyway, let's see. There were other fantastic things I wanted to fit in. And I mentioned Greg Sargent's piece this morning from his Morning Plum. I think it makes a lot of the same points, but maybe it wraps things up well enough that we can close the DACA segment on this one. Don't buy the latest round of laughable Trump White House spin, says Greg Sargent. Donald Trump is suddenly overcome with a profound sense of concern over the possibility that he may be abusing his own power as president. No, really. This is what multiple news organizations are now reporting and asking us to believe. But given Trump's track record when it comes to constraining his authority thus far, perhaps a hint of skepticism is in order. The president is nearing a very difficult decision on the fate of some 800,000 people who were brought to this country illegally as children. He has to decide whether to end the Obama-era executive action that shields those people, the Dreamers, from deportation and permits them to work, which is called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's DACA. From news reports, we are now getting a deeper glimpse into the deliberation of Trump and his top advisors on this dilemma. Axios reports that the White House is keenly aware that ending DACA would create major complications for businesses that employ these people. He's twice said these people or those people. It's going to get him in trouble. Some White House staffers are also worried about facing scalding criticism for ending the program, which would uproot the lives of so many people who were brought here through no fault of their own, who are thoroughly American and who want to contribute positively to American life. Staffers view the opprobrium they would face as akin to that which met Trump's thinly veiled Muslim ban, his pullout from the Paris climate deal, and his failure to unambiguously condemn the Charlottesville white supremacists. In other words, some people in the White House appear to believe that ending protections for the Dreamers would constitute a monstrous and deeply consequential moral wrong on a par with some of the very worst things we have seen from Trump thus far. And apparently, I guess I would add that some of the people who believe that this would be monstrous and a deeply consequential moral wrong would be Donald Trump circa 2012. But according to Axios, Trump may pull the plug on DACA because the prevailing White House view is that continuing it would be illegal. And the quote here from Axios, senior officials tell us the majority view inside the Trump administration is that DACA is illegal, and the only way to deal with the problem of illegal immigrants who arrived here as children is for Congress to act. The Associated Press similarly reports that Trump is expected to end the program. Sources tell the AP that the administration is deeply split between those who argue for keeping the program, guess who? Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, big whoop, and the immigration hardliners who have argued that it is unconstitutional. Stephen Miller, who doesn't know what he's talking about, Jeff Sessions, who is a lawyer and doesn't know what he's talking about, the now departed Stephen K. Bannon, who isn't a lawyer and melts hot tubs and maybe a meth head, and he doesn't know either. Maybe a meth head, I don't know. So Trump is likely to side with the immigration hardliners, who are leaking that they believe keeping this executive action violates the Constitution, and this will be the defense for ending it. Greg says, this is all Greg, but Greg says, are you freaking kidding me? Are we really supposed to believe the constitutionality of the program is weighing on Trump or will be instrumental in shaping his final decision? It is a truly shocking coincidence that the same advisors who are telling Trump that DACA is unconstitutional were also the ones most responsible for the disguised Muslim ban and also pushed Trump to pardon Joe Arpaio. Bannon and Miller were key drivers of the ban's original rollout. They both reportedly favored pardoning Arpaio. My point is not just that this strongly suggests their view of DACA's constitutionality is rooted in their hostility to immigrants, though it does. It is also that this hints at an amusing double standard on the part of the White House's immigration hardline faction when it comes to the care with which they approach Trump's exercise of his authority. Bannon and Miller's haste to rush out the travel ban led them to trample all over the legal process for such measures, which in turn helped lead to its initial blockage by the courts. Bannon and Miller also appear to have privately told Trump that pardoning Arpaio would please his base, which only underscores how cavalier they were about a major decision with serious separation of powers implications. While Trump's pardon power is quasi-absolute, at least he says quasi, there is widespread agreement that this nonetheless constituted an abuse of his power, something that plainly did not concern Bannon and Miller. Nor was Trump remotely concerned about the legal details surrounding his use of executive authority to institute the veiled ban on Muslims, or about the prospect that pardoning Arpaio might constitute an abuse of his power. And do we really need to remind you of Trump's abuses of power and lawlessness in other areas, the Emoluments Clause violations, the firing of the FBI director over the Russia probe after demanding his loyalty, the rage at his attorney general for failing to protect him from that probe, and the obvious use of the Arpaio pardon to signal that more pardons on Russia may be coming? To be clear, I'm not arguing that there is not a legitimate debate over whether DACA is constitutional. There is. My own view is that DACA and Obama's attempted expansion of it, which was blocked by the courts, are legitimate exercises of executive discretion. But it's not really that unreasonable to argue that they aren't. DACA and its expansion did push hard into new legal territory. It is plausible that the courts would strike DACA down. This would not be a wildly absurd decision. Similarly, though some conservatives like to pretend DACA's unconstitutionality is an easy call, this is actually grounds for a legitimate legal dispute in both directions. Indeed, 4 Supreme Court justices and a host of legal experts, including ones who lean to the right, did not see Obama's expansion of it as illegal. Many argue DACA is legal, so this is not a slam dunk case in either direction. But does anyone really believe that Trump, Bannon, or Miller, of all people, are motivated by any good faith effort to determine whether DACA constitutes an abuse of the president's power? Come on now. Seriously? And that's pretty much where I'd stand on it, too. I think we delivered pretty much the same message to you. And I think that, well, let me see. Unless there's anything else, that would probably wrap up our DACA consideration for the moment. A couple of other things that we really need to revisit from yesterday or earlier, just by way of updating some of our earlier stories. The Utah hospital where Alex Wubbles works, the nurse who was illegally detained, accosted, assaulted by the police detective from Salt Lake over the drawing of the blood sample. Just by way of updating that story, the hospital now has a new policy. Great job for your department there, buddy. Cops are not allowed to talk to the nurses anymore. You got to talk to a shift supervisor or some administrative officer there before you're able to deal with the nurses at all, and they are restricted from access to patient care areas, which could be pretty much anywhere in a hospital. So you've done a great disservice to your department, not just in public relations, but now in doing your own police work. Really, that was just fantastic. You're so super smart about that one. Let's see. Other updates on some of our lingering stories. One will require a little bit more discussion, but we'll get to it after the break. But by way of teasing it, I have a little bit more about bots, both Russian and otherwise, and what they're up to. Another specific example of how they're being deployed in the current situation. And one other piece of information, and I guess we need to dive back into that story and give a fuller explanation. But yet another international incident regarding or bringing into it Russian interference with elections and other democratic functions. Now Germany joining the list of countries that have that suspect they have become subject to Russian hacking attacks. That in addition to, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and maybe Kenya as well, as they reverse the results of their election there and call for an actual do-over. And, let's see. What other fun things do we have? Well, we'll get to them on the other side, of course. But here's something that I think I can do in about 2 seconds. This was just interesting. We'll roll our music, of course, and then do it over that. But how about this one? This is just a quick tweet I picked up. GPS data show that the Hurricane Harvey flood was so large, so heavy, all that water, that it actually flexed the Earth's crust, pushing Houston down by about 2 centimeters. Amazing. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the closing segment of the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Thanks very much. What a teaser I gave you right just before the break. I totally did it on purpose. I wanted to cram in one more story, and now I'm forced to bring it back up again on the other side of the break. But it's damn interesting. I can't go into detail about it. I don't know that much detail about it. I saw a tweet, and it was amazing. Chris Milliner is responsible for the tweet. He, an earthquake scientist with NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I didn't even realize they had earthquake scientists, but I suppose that they're of use everywhere. And what do they call an earthquake on Mars? A Marsquake? I ask that guy. I'll totally waste his time. Anyway, GPS data collected after the Harvey flood showed that it was so large, water is heavy, that it flexed the Earth's crust. Now, I got that part across. What we missed was by how much. And it turns out Houston sank, not underwater, we already knew that, but the crust of the earth underneath, the actual Houston that's covered with water, sank by 2 centimeters, approximately 2 centimeters, which is a pretty significant thing. Usually I'm just used to hearing that these things like, well, the crust shifted and the location of this city from this earthquake moved by 2 millimeters. And it's measurable, it's a thing, but 2 centimeters is pretty significant. I mean, in these types of measurements anyway. Imagine there's that much water. You depressed the Earth's crust and moved an entire city downward. That is pretty amazing. That's a lot of water. And it's amazing that they can measure such things. I just found that fascinating. It won't affect anything about DACA. Donald Trump won't understand it. It doesn't matter. Although it's possible that, who knows what he might think about this. Oh my God, the Earth is going to implode. We need to get on a space ark. I got no idea what that's going to do to Donald Trump. It could panic him, and maybe it's best that we just not tell him. Anyway, I was saying I think that we've wrapped up on DACA for the day, although certainly if there's anything that you think we've missed, be sure to let us know, and we'll see if we can't double back on some of it. Now, there are some other stories that we didn't explain fully, and some that we need to follow up on. Let's do the follow up. I thought this might be an additional or an interesting addition to our discussion of bots, which I feel like was incomplete yesterday, and I need more examples of what bots do and how they work and how they can be deployed. Not technologically speaking, although I definitely need more information about that, but how do they change the narrative? Like most of us have understood, okay, well, if it looks like there's billions of people tweeting Trump support all the time, that can be kind of depressing during an election, and maybe it's meant to drive Hillary supporters out of the public square. I understood all of that. What are they doing now that they're out of the context of an election? And I have this piece here in, what is this? Arc Digital Media. arcdigital.media, which I don't know what it is. But anyway, it is written by a fairly popular Twitter personality, Caroline O, who has lots and lots of followers, and who I find mostly occupies the anti-Trump space somewhere along the spectrum. I worry sometimes about picking up on the threads that she writes because they push us, like my measure for all this is, are we being pushed toward Louise Mensch territory or Claude Taylor territory? And I don't put them in the same category exactly, but she's pretty aggressive in her anti-Trump writings, but it's mostly pretty based, reality based. And I'm sure that there are some threads which are perhaps given to flights of fancy now and again, but I think she's trying very hard to stay grounded and realistic in these things. But maybe I misread her. But maybe you're a fan and you could offer me your take on her stuff. But this, I thought, seemed like it didn't require any particularly fanciful flights here of imagination to figure out how this might happen. How Russian and alt-right Twitter accounts worked together to skew the narrative about Berkeley. And here we're on the subject of the anti-fascist folks, the Antifa, and I have a follow-up piece on that. I think two interesting things to think about if you are in the camp where there's a lefty camp that's very critical of Antifa, and I can understand why. Violence sometimes ensues, and the natural inclination for many leftists is to shy away from that because violence, not good, generally speaking. But let me put this out there and see if we can construct a little narrative. I have mixed feelings about all of it, and I'm still willing to see Nazis punched, though I haven't been doing a great deal of Nazi punching myself. How Russian and alt-right Twitter accounts work together to skew the narrative about Berkeley, one of the latest of the planned confrontations between Antifa and the alt-right forces. Here's the deal, as Carolyn sees it. Social media has an important role in shaping perceptions of current events. Clearly true, right? As well as influencing mainstream news coverage of those events. Yes, that's why I'm here, to be honest. Platforms like Twitter provide real-time access to events going on around the world, allowing anyone to get a front row seat for breaking news. But as much as it has opened up new channels of information, social media has also opened up new avenues for manipulating perceptions of reality. Misinformation and disinformation often spread faster than the truth, almost always. And by the time the narrative is corrected, social media has already moved on to the next big thing. The narrative surrounding last weekend's protests in Berkeley took shape on social media and was picked up, at least in part, by mainstream news outlets. The result was a skewed presentation of events that was almost entirely devoid of the context in which they took place. Even more troubling, that narrative was influenced by pro-Russian social media networks, including state-sponsored propaganda outlets, botnets, cyborgs, and individual users. In the case study below, I describe how the narrative surrounding Berkeley was picked up and shaped by Russian-linked influence networks, which saw a chance to drive a wedge in American society and ran with it. Next, I look at the individual accounts and users that were identified as top influencers on Twitter and explore what they were posting, how they worked together to craft a narrative, and the methods they used to amplify their message. Finally, I look at how news coverage of the events in Berkeley was shaped by the skewed narrative that emerged on social media. This is just a single case study in a larger story, but it serves as an important reminder that Russia is still exploiting social media to harm U.S. interests, and that plenty of Americans are willing to join in on the effort. Here's the Russian connection part of it. Russian-linked influence networks and propaganda arms quickly took interest in the Berkeley protests last weekend. On Sunday afternoon, the top story on the front page of Russian propaganda outlet RT was about the events in Berkeley. Note that this was the main landing page, not the America section. And there's a screenshot there of the events, and it says here, at least 8 arrested as left and right-wing protesters face off in Berkeley. Illustrated with a photo from what was going on out there. RT tweeted stories about the protests throughout the day Sunday and some on Saturday, posting dramatic images and using trending hashtags to maximize their reach. Many of these tweets were retweeted by the semi-automated pro-Kremlin account at Team Trump Russia, a.k.a. Deplorable Russian, but written with Cyrillic characters, which spent much of the day amplifying the hashtags Berkeley and Antifa. And there's several examples of those tweets embedded here. On Twitter, the hashtag Berkeley was amplified by Russian-linked influence networks, as evidenced by the output of the Hamilton 68 dashboard, a project of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Have you heard of this thing? Which tracks the activity of 600 Twitter accounts linked to Russian influence operations. These include state-sponsored propaganda outlets like Sputnik and RT, as well as individual users, automated accounts, bots, and cyborgs, which we explained yesterday, are accounts that produce automated content some of the time, but are human-controlled at other times, that actively and frequently amplify Kremlin propaganda, knowingly and in some cases, potentially unknowingly. Between the hours of 4 p.m. EST and 8 p.m. EST on Sunday, the hashtag Berkeley soared to the top spot among the most frequently used hashtags on Hamilton 68's dashboard. The number of times the hashtag Berkeley was used increased by a staggering 27,600% during that time period. at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Berkeley was not even in the top 10 hashtags, though the related hashtag Antifa was in 9th place. But in a span of just 4 hours, the number of times the hashtag Berkeley was used within the Russian-influenced linked influence network increased by, again, a staggering 27,600%, making it the top hashtag measured by the number of times it was used, and the top trending hashtag measured by the percentage increase in the frequency of use. As Berkeley shot up to the top spot, the hashtag, Antifa, also climbed the charts. Within the same 4-hour window, 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., Antifa went from 9th place to 6th place among the most frequently used hashtags within the sample of 600 accounts linked to Russian influence campaigns. 3 of the top 10 most frequently shared URLs within the Russian linked influence network were related to Antifa or the Berkeley protests, says Hamilton 68. Looking further, I guess I could probably skip those because she then re-summarizes this when she re-enters with her own writing. Looking further, 3 of the top 10 most frequently shared URLs were related to Antifa or the Berkeley protests, as were 2 of the top 10 trending URLs on the Hamilton 68 dashboard. 2 of those were news articles. One was a Periscope video made by Irma Hinojosa, a far-right pro-Trump activist. And there are some embedded lists of the top tags and top trends. As noted by the researchers who run Hamilton 68, these trends show that users in the network of Russian-linked influence operations wanted to exploit unrest in the U.S. and amplify alt-right alarmism about the left-wing Antifa, or anti-fascist, movement. For several consecutive days this week, the most tweeted link in the network was a whitehouse.gov petition seeking to declare Antifa a terrorist group. Not the alt-right, of course, who actually murdered somebody the last time the 2 of these groups got together, but Antifa. Gee whiz. In addition to promoting hashtags and a direct link to the whitehouse.gov site, stories about the petition were the most retweeted by 2 different Twitter accounts for Russian propaganda outlet RT. Ruptly, that's what it says, an RT-affiliated account also heavily pushed a video clip showing footage of a fight between neo-Nazis and Antifa activists in Berlin, according to Hamilton 68. To get a better idea of who was pushing the hashtag and spreading content, that would be information, misinformation, and disinformation about the protests, I explored the top contributors to the hashtag Berkeley and Antifa. On Berkeley, first I searched for users tweeting about Berkeley. As seen below, the top contributors measured by engagement included a mix of individual Twitter users on the left and the right/alt-right, as well as several local reporters and 1 local news agency. Alt-right/far-right Trump supporters comprised the largest group of top contributors. For the sake of comparison, I performed a similar search on the hashtag Berkeley on a different platform, and with a slightly more restricted time range to capture the most recent tweets only, as of about 5 p.m. Eastern Time. The sample for this search was smaller due to the more restrictive search criteria, but the results were largely in line with the first search. Top contributors included political activists, left and right/alt-right, along with media figures and reporters. However, compared to the initial search, alt-right/far-right Trump supporters made up a larger proportion of the top contributors to the sample of more recent Berkeley tweets, indicating that they likely started tweeting and retweeting more as the protests turned violent. Once it started trending, the alt-right made a concerted effort to flood the hashtag Berkeley with negative posts about hashtag Antifa in an attempt to saturate the hashtag, as well as to mix in some misinformation and disinformation to muddy the waters. The purpose was to create and then establish control of the narrative, skew perceptions of the event and those involved in it, and influence mainstream media coverage by boosting the visibility of certain content. The Antifa hashtag, while contributors to the Berkeley hashtag were a mix of progressive/liberal activists, journalists, and news outlets, as well as alt-right and far-right Trump supporters, the hashtag Antifa looked quite different. Nearly all of the top influencers were alt-right/far-right Trump supporters, including Mike Cernovich, Paul Joseph Watson, Irma Hinojosa, Mike Tokes, Nick Short, Bill Mitchell, and Dinesh D'Souza. Only 2 of the top 30 influencers were not part of this alt-right, far-right group. Myself and investigative journalist Shane Bauer, who has extensively covered right-wing extremist movements, as well as the protest-related clashes instigated by far-right agitators. Notably, a fake Julian Assange account was the most influential contributor to the hashtag Antifa, and both Roger Stone and Nigel Farage were also among the top influencers. Interestingly, Alan Dershowitz was another top influencer for the hashtag Antifa, while Fox News was the only media organization in the top 30 of influencers. A final noteworthy observation, the third most influential contributor to the Antifa hashtag was one of the many fake Antifa accounts, Beverly Hills Antifa, created in the spring and summer of 2017. Now, about crafting that narrative, what are these accounts tweeting about and what kind of narrative were they trying to create? To find out, I looked at tweets from some of the top influencers as well as some of the top accounts that they were retweeting and that were retweeting them. Many of the top influencers, particularly under the hashtag Antifa, were amplifying their message by retweeting each other and sharing the same content repeatedly. Below is a random sample of tweets using the hashtag Antifa, and as you can see, and you will see when you look on your own, the hashtag was dominated by negative and inflammatory tweets about Antifa, with several accounts trying to label Antifa as a terrorist organization. I'll expand on this in another article, but Antifa is not an organization. Antifa is short for anti-fascist, so the term describes an ideological position as well as the broad activist movement driven by it. Encompassed within this larger movement are individuals and loosely connected groups, but Antifa is not a group. Other dominant themes included a concerted effort to connect Antifa to the Democratic Party and to smear the name of Black Lives Matter, as well as to shift the focus from the surge of right-wing extremist violence to the individual actions of, quote, leftist protesters in other languages like English, protesters. Notably, in this random sample of tweets, all of those tweeting about Antifa were doing so in a negative manner, showing how an orchestrated effort can really saturate a hashtag and skew the related sentiment, content, and narrative. Looking at tweets from some of the top influencers as well as those amplifying them, you can see the narrative surrounding Antifa really starts to take shape. The dominant themes all involve presenting an exaggerated threat and promoting right-wing alarmism about that threat. These themes included labeling Antifa as a terrorist organization, trying to link Antifa to George Soros, presenting Antifa as the aggressor, and far-right extremists as the victims, and trying to portray Antifa as the real fascists. Both siderism, also a common tactic used often in an attempt to equate hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan with Antifa, and just for good measure, Black Lives Matter thrown in there as well. Well, I want to move on from the article. There's plenty more to go on and lots of analysis that backs up the conclusion here, but I think the conclusion is fairly clear, and we did begin to see it taking hold in the media. Lots of tweets over the weekend, some of which I put aside, some of which I did not, but basically reminding people, one, that it isn't necessarily one coherent movement, and two, still some mixed questions about whether Nazis, whether it's more effective to punch them, kick them, yell at them, protest them, ignore them, what have you. And of course, the reactions to statements like that from, say, Nancy Pelosi looking to distance Democrats from Antifa activity, which is not necessarily a silly idea. She's protecting a brand, and it's going to be her role to set herself apart from that. It wasn't an official Democratic Party organization that was showing up doing these protests, although lots of people consider themselves part of both movements. But she quite properly is trying to distance herself. But, you know, there's going to be some disagreement about the language used and what it's supposed to mean. I give a lot of leeway to a lot of this. But I think there's been some great pushback, and that's good. And I wanted to highlight some of that. Let me start with this piece here. I've got a tweet storm that is pretty amazing. I mentioned earlier in the story that I was just reading Paul Joseph Watson. That's Prison Planet, the Alex Jones conspiracy theorist type guy. And one of his contributions to this effort to brand anti-fascists as A, fascists themselves, and B, terrorists, was this one, his tweet with a picture of Antifa forces and the shields that they had at the Berkeley confrontation. He writes in accompaniment with this photo, "The most hateful group in America. Orwell rolls in his grave." Basically, the idea that Antifa, though they are anti-fascist, are in fact the biggest users of fascist tactics around. And the Orwell rolls in his grave part apparently struck a nerve with Mike Stuchberry. Who is Mike Stuchberry? Well, let's see. I'll open up his profile so we can get a look at that. It says here, game show champion, history obsessive, writer, broadcaster, and traveler. So, what does he have to say? Well, it sounds like he might have paid some real attention in history class. Orwell rolls in his grave that anti-fascists should call themselves such. And, of course, the idea that, well, sure, they say they're anti-fascist, but, violence is terrible and we shouldn't be punching Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this is a little bit of a counter-narrative to that. Mike says this, this guy starts off with a picture of Generalissimo, some would say, Francisco Franco. Well, he led a military coup in 1936, allied with Hitler, took Nazi support. So you had these guys, Prison Planet, the nationalists, straight up fascists, and a picture of them, fighting these guys, the Republicans, outgunned and outmanned. Of course, the Republicans would have been the anti-fascists of the time, the Spanish Civil War. Between 1936 and 1939, the nationalists rolled across Spain, besieging Republican strongholds such as Barcelona. Pretty damn important to nationalist success was Nazi support, particularly from bombers of the Condor Legion. Maybe you know this picture in which he embeds a photo of the Pablo Picasso work Guernica. Maybe you know this picture of Prison Planet. It shows the aftermath of a bombing raid on the town of Guernica on the 26th of April, 1937. It's a painting by Pablo Picasso, obviously, and it's one of the most powerful anti-war statements ever made. Now, in an attempt to support the Republicans, communist organizations, yes, from all over the world formed international brigades to fight in the Spanish Civil War. There was a British battalion in the Spanish Civil War comprising volunteers who wanted to support the fight against fascism. Embedded in a photo by way of illustration is the banner of the 35th Division, 15th Brigade, British Battalion. Now, one of the volunteers for the British Battalion, of course, Eric Arthur Blair, a.k.a. George Orwell. Orwell fought fascists on the front line until he was shot through the throat. He then returned to England. Orwell's time fighting fascists in Spain had such an impact on him, he wrote one of the defining books on it. Here's the cover, Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. So, if Orwell was here, Prison Planet, he'd be looking at these Nazi effers on parade and reaching for his rifle. True, Stalinism terrified Orwell, but what enraged him was fascism, Prison Planet. He was ready to die to oppose it. So you can take your BS Antifa ravings and shove them. You have no knowledge, no credibility, selling hate to the pig ignorant. Amazing. And it concludes here, of course, by saying, well, guess what, you hateful turd, and then including a no pasaran poster from the Republican anti-fascist forces during the Spanish Civil War. A famous episode in history, but apparently no recollection of it over at Prison Planet, and no recognition of the incredible irony that of invoking Orwell in all of this. I thought that was an important point to add to our discussion about it. I do have much more. And one of these days, like maybe, I don't know, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we'll get to rounding up the international brigades fighting against Russian influence and interference in their elections. Of course, we're not fighting on each other's soil, but again, I wanted to note that Germany joins the ranks now of countries taking active measures to prevent or undo what they see as Russian influence in their elections. Apparently, Angela Merkel's party in the election subject of Russian cyber attacks over the last couple of days as they head into their election season. Let's see other interesting and amazing things that we could bring up and still, let's see, get on the record before we cut out for the day. Here's one. Let me add this here. We got this tweet the other day, which I thought was interesting, and a good Labor Day tweet from our good Twitter friend BJ Hutch, is MTL GRL like Metal Girl or some other abbreviation? I couldn't tell you, but anyway, she pointed me to this fantastic piece from or a tweet from Seth Hanlon and an attached Globe and Mail article. Canada demands that the U.S. end right-to-work laws as part of NAFTA talks. I thought that was really rather a brilliant play. You want to have a renegotiation of NAFTA? Okay, fine. We're not actually serious in indulging you in that, but one of the things we'll have a little chat about while we're sitting at the table is Canada believes that lax labor standards both in Mexico and, yes, the United States, where right-to-work laws take apart labor standards, is stealing Canadian jobs. And a familiar refrain, of course, among Americans who are opposed to offshoring of jobs, well, of course, lax labor standards and low pay, et cetera, draws manufacturers to move their operations overseas to take advantage of low pay and lax labor standards, and that's stealing American jobs. Well, guess what? The same narrative can work for Canada. You want to renegotiate this thing? We'll renegotiate it this way. Look, there can't be any situation between partners in this thing, if you want to remain partners in this thing, that steals Canadian jobs and moves them elsewhere to low-paying third world countries like the United States of America. It was a damn good point, and I thank you for bringing it up and bringing it to our attention. It was an interesting edition in particular for Labor Day, so thank you for doing it. And how was your Labor Day? I forgot to ask. We'll leave it for the end of the show. And, you can update me through the KITM hashtag, through email, through Twitter. We'll be talking before we get back here with tomorrow's show. Things may be looking up for the possibility of getting Greg and or Joan on the air, but I'd like to have this echo completely taken care of. We'll see what we can do in between then and now. We got a few more tricks up the sleeve, and of course the new computer is coming shortly, and hopefully that will resolve everything and keep everything fresh and exciting for you. What about what's coming up next on Netroots Radio on the after show? Batting cleanup once again, and you know how to find that now, right? Netrootsradio.com. Couldn't be easier. What's coming up on their show today? The EPA Deputy Associate Administrator for Public Affairs has been given the power to veto federal grants if they mention climate change. Of course, super high-ranking official, right? Texas law allows Houston landlords to demand rent from tenants who cannot return to their flooded, damaged, unlivable homes, and they're doing it, of course. And, of course, giving cash to trusted and established organizations is better than clothes and other in-kind donations after disasters. For the last half, they'll be visiting with Chris Reeves for a discussion on a Missouri state representative's disturbing calls for lynching parties. They're all disturbing when you're calling for lynching parties. That and much more to come on the after show right after this.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
How about this for some more interesting discussion with Chris Reeves? How DACA deportations will affect the breadbasket of the world, and the nuts and bolts to rectifying bad deals with vendors running your campaign. In case you want to take over the world and get rid of Donald Trump, here's how you can do it. Stay tuned for all that and more on the After Show next.